Okay, let's get right into it then. One of the things I was most interested in talking to you about, obviously, was the publishing industry and how you feel that things like identity politics, social media, call out culture, all of these types of things has impacted the publishing industry. How have you seen the publishing industry change over maybe the past few decades or even the past couple decades as a result of these new trends?
I think a lot of the change has been only in the last few years, uh, at most the last 10. I get the impression that a lot of the constraint that I sense is invisible, and there's no public record of it. If nothing else, a lot of writers have been made anxious about what they write,
Mm-hmm.
and self-conscious in a way that I think is destructive of creativity and exploration, and inclined to, adhere to that creepy creative writing homily about write about what you know. um, in other words, to constrain yourself so to what is officially, in the terms of this culture, your business, which isn't much. And it's very difficult to measure self-censorship. You can't tell what people are not writing. So a lot of what I feel is just that. It's a feeling. It's a sense of the climate that we're writing in, and how anxious making it is to venture out of your own little box. And it's particularly germane to anything to do with race.
Yeah.
So, I did something daring in my new novel, and I did it on purpose, and I know that I'm going to get it in the neck. But one of the reasons that I included a black character, actually, there are a couple of black characters, is that I first of all, that's the universe I live in, and that's the universe that my characters live in. So why not? But also, I'm making a political point
Mm-hmm.
that it has to be possible for white writers to be able to write characters of different races, and if all of my white colleagues suddenly concur that this is too terrifying and it's going to get them into trouble, we introduce a weird kind of literary apartheid that isn't healthy for literature, isn't good for readers, and certainly isn't good for fiction writers.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one thing that I've thought about this trend and this sort of this enforcement on writers in particular, or people who make art in general, that they can only speak about themselves, they can only speak about identities that they personally identify with. I mean, it seems like an odd way to relate to the world because, you should be trying to relate to other people and other people's experiences, I think, in general, but particularly, if you're writing novels, I don't know why anyone would want an author to write only about, white middle class people if they happen to be white and middle class. It just doesn't seem very interesting.
It isn't interesting, and my own personal life is not that interesting, and I don't want, therefore, to write about only myself all the time.
Yeah, you'll run out of content really fast, I think.
But
Or I would in any case.
very fast. But what you mentioned about the way that you, in order to have standing, as you would put it in legal terms, to pass comment on a range of contemporary issues, you have to belong to the group about whom your opinion applies. And I just reject that out of hand. Other people are a part of my universe and part of my experience of the world. And I don't want to be reduced to the point where the only person about whom I have a right to an opinion is me. or people who are virtually identical to me, uh, people of all races, of all nationalities, of all sexual proclivities. They're a part of my world. They come in and out of my life. And if there is such a thing as freedom of speech and freedom of thought, then I should be free to say what I think about these people and their problems and their views, and be able to have a discussion or even an argument. So I reject the whole idea, this whole new idea of standing. That recurrent phrase now in public discourse that as a as a you know as a gay man, etc. That as an X uh, is now this reflex establishment of your right to say anything.
Mm-hmm. And how much has this impacted you personally, and in terms of your career, in terms of your ability to publish or write what you want to write about? How has this new trend around, cultural appropriation and identity politics, again, what we've been talking about, how much has that impacted you? Has it at all?
It is starting to have an effect on me. It's certainly having an effect on the way my work is read and reviewed, especially among a certain narrow band of the wokery. uh, and there's a loss in that. It's a very flat, anti-literary way to read fiction. Um, it means that a certain kind of critic is going to be exclusively looking for sins against liberal or so-called liberal orthodoxy.
Mm-hmm.
That means not really following the story or getting involved in it or appreciating the language. It's just looking for mistakes. And that's why I was a little mischievous in the book that hasn't seen print yet. It's making my publisher very nervous. But I figure I'm going to be read that way anyway. So rather than just keep my head below the parapet, I accept the fact that I have already stuck my head above the parapet. And in sticking my neck out, I have called attention to myself, and I have put a bullseye on my own forehead, and I am an enemy of certain people.
Mm-hmm.
Given who they are, that doesn't really bother me. I mean, it's a badge of nobility, actually. But there is a price to pay, and there could theoretically be a serious price to pay at some point. Because, it'd be one thing if we were talking about some narrow, kind of out there, shrill extremists, purists, basically members of a cult. And we are, of course, talking about members of a cult. But that cult has taken over mainstream media, mm-hmm. and the whole sensibility has taken over mainstream institutions like publishing companies, certainly like universities, increasingly anything to do with Hollywood, and mainstream journalism. Mm-hmm. So, if you take a look at the New York Times lately, it is just chock-a-block with all of this creepy, hard left language, and it's not used with quotation marks. Mm-hmm. So that people will be identified as cisgendered. I hate that word so much.
Yeah.
Which fundamentally pathologizes normalcy, right? It becomes one more sickness or one more kink. I tripped up yesterday's paper had allyship in it. I hate that word too. It's so awkward.
Yeah,
it's everywhere. So I haven't just alienated a bunch of weirdos. Uh, the weirdos are in the driver's seat. And whether all these people who are in positions of institutional power necessarily accept hard left orthodoxy as necessarily correct, they at least perceive that it is really important for their reputation and the reputation of their institution and whatever it is, they produce to be seen as adhering to these principles. And so it doesn't even matter what they really think. I mean, the weird thing is that a lot of this hard left orthodoxy is at odds with mainstream opinion, normal people.
Yeah.
Who are also starting to get the message that they have to keep their mouths shut.
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing that I find odd about all this is that most people in the world don't agree with these ideas and don't really understand what all these buzzwords mean. Like all these buzzwords, all these progressive buzzwords that really I don't think actually mean anything, have gone mainstream. And people just say them over and over and over again. And I don't think they've ever really stopped to consider what these words mean or why they're using them. But for most people in the world, yeah, I don't think they are on board with all this, and yet it completely dominates mainstream media and reporting and journalism, and it's really creepy because at this point, journalists aren't doing their jobs anymore because they're trying to toe the line.
Well, we're talking about a larger cultural climate which has become extremely fearful.
Yeah.
Obedient, anti-creative, obsessed with rules and appearances, and my other problem with the pervasive climate is that the two matters that are most incendiary and make people most nervous are race and gender. And so my experience is that we are going wildly backwards in relation to both issues. Mm-hmm. That we're now hyper conscious of race rather than getting past it, obsessed with it, in fact. I mean, there's hardly an issue that doesn't get connected in some way to race. Some days I read the paper and realize how virtually every article I'm reading, especially say if it's about domestic politics in the U.S., is somehow tied into race, however obliquely. Mm-hmm. And gender the same. We're not getting beyond gender. We're now obsessed with gender. We're in I've written about this before in constructing this artificial gender continuum. We are nailing down gender stereotypes, and I'm not really interested in gender particularly. I've never been especially interested in being female. It was an accident. I didn't choose it.
Yeah.
And I have to deal with it in the same way that men have to deal with, waking up in the crib and there's something between their legs and I have something different. But it's not been a driving issue of my life. By default, I guess I've described myself on occasion as a feminist because as far as I have understood it from a young age, it means that you think that women are of equal value to men and should be given the same opportunities in life. Mm-hmm. It's a pretty moderate proposition, and I can get with that. But the issues that have grabbed me haven't really had to do with the gender wars, and I feel that I've been really fortunate, given when I was born, so that the heavy lifting was done by the generation before me, if not also, of course, the generation before that. I mean, the big barriers were broken, so that my life has been relatively easy. And of course, I know what it's like to meet men who are condescending toward you, and you can tell, that they're not interested because you're a woman, and that happens to women all the time, and it still does. Mm-hmm. And I'm not going to pretend that everything is all pink, but it's so much better than it used to be, and women are actually outpacing men in a lot of areas, including, getting higher education. I mean, this is actually constitutionally not like me, because I'm a bit of a pessimist, and I have always tended to look on the dark side. But in relation to women's rights, I'm a real glass half full person, because I think we've come a long way in historically a short period of time. It is astonishing how much has changed during my lifetime, and I am grateful.
Yeah.
And that's not a very popular viewpoint right now, but I have a tendency to be drawn to unpopular viewpoints.
Yeah, I have lately also. And I mean, and one of those aspects of feminism and the women's movement that you have been critical of is the Me Too movement. I mean, I think at first you were supportive, and then, a bit later on you said you felt that it had gone too far. So I wonder if you can talk a bit about that. What are your concerns with Me Too? What's concerning you in terms of how that's shaped up that movement?
I think I traced an arc similar to the arc that a lot of other women did, perhaps men as well. That the original revelations, starting with Harvey Weinstein, were horrific, and it was good they came to light, and it was good that he was shamed and humiliated. And there were many more cases of gravity and substance that meant, this seemed like an important moment and a positive movement. But it didn't take very long before it just became this bandwagon-y thing, and the kinds of things that women were complaining about in a very public way, often without much evidence, were increasingly petty, and more a matter of judgment, or you had to be there, rather than factual. This happened and that happened, and anyone would think that was terrible, right? And it also grew very anti-male. I don't believe in being anti-male. That's half the human race. And it also grew anti-sex, and I'm pro-sex. And I don't perceive all penetrative sex as an assault. It is actually how human beings reproduce most of the time still.
Yeah.
And it's definitely the most graceful way to do it. And it started feeling very prim, which was reminiscent of the late 50s, pre-liberation 1960s that I grew up in, where sex was icky and repulsive. And I'm not into that. So I just thought it veered, the whole movement veered in a weird direction pretty fast, in a way that I was no longer comfortable with endorsing anymore. And one shouldn't have to say this, but Obviously, I don't support sexual assault or sexual harassment. Although one of the weird things about that, the whole Me Too movement, was it was as if nobody had ever talked about this stuff before. And we had. In fact, in the 1990s, there was a huge hoo-ha over sexual harassment in the workplace. And we forgot all about it. And I just thought someone should say, hey, remember that? We've actually talked about this before. Now, it doesn't mean we can't talk about it again, but it was a little odd that the whole thing was approached as if we finally started talking about sexual harassment, and actually we had discussed it at great length.
Yeah, it's funny how quickly history is forgotten, and I find that happens particularly with the feminist movement, with the women's movement, where the young feminists of this generation, the third wavers, seem to have no idea what happened during the second wave or even the first wave. And so they're just kind of reinventing the wheel over and over and over again.
Yeah, and along with that lack of historical awareness is falling into what to me are traps, like this weakness trap, this helplessness trap. I mean, these are very old female tropes. You don't want them. You don't want to promote yourself as unable to handle yourself, as having no agency, as always blaming other people for what happens to you. You know, older feminists got into things like martial arts, right? That's a much healthier reaction than getting all quivery that someone put his hand on your knee and you didn't like it. Do something about it.
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess I would say, I mean, I part of the problem is that, I mean, physically, women are weaker than men. So even if they are trained to fend men off, it might not work. But I will say that I'm troubled by this idea that women are traumatized so easily and that they kind of can't recover from that trauma.
Yes.
And I'm not talking about, serious, domestic violence, like ongoing abuse really does a number on you, and sexual assault and things like that. But I suppose things like, the smaller incidences that have been blown up and that have been attached to the Me Too movement in a way that doesn't really make sense when we're talking about things like sexual assault, things like violence, rape, and then these, kind of bad dates, like the Aziz Ansari thing is an example that's brought up often because it's like, nothing really happened to you. Like, he was kind of sleazy, and that was, he behaved kind of like...
Well, she didn't do anything. I mean, in other words, if she didn't like it, she could have stopped it. He did not force himself at all on her. So if she went home and thought, well, I didn't really enjoy that, what she should have asked herself is, therefore, why didn't I leave? And that particular story was one of the turning points of the Me Too movement, because it was the point at which the conversation veered into a completely different area. And which isn't to say there's anything wrong with having a discussion about bad dates and maybe you should call it quits, or how can we improve communication sexually? How can we be more honest about what we want? But it's a slightly different conversation.
Right, or, talking critically about how men behave on dates and like you said, better communication between men and women.
That is a very different conversation than talking about sexual assault and especially rape. And what happened with the Me Too movement is that all these, what are comparatively minor complaints, kind of quality of life issues, got thrown in with rape. And, I take rape very seriously. Fortunately, that's never happened to me, but it could. The statistics on how many women are raped are staggering, and I wouldn't want it. I wouldn't want that crime to be thrown in the same conversation or the same movement with bad dates. That's just not the same thing, and I don't think that does justice to real victims. I mean, one of the things that seemed to be going on with the Me Too movement is that, it's part of this larger victimhood culture, so that women got the impression that in order to be heard and to be important, to have standing, to be able to say things, uh, to get people's attention, they had to be victims. And therefore, there was this piling on with everyone having a story about having been treated badly in some way. And I reject that as what we should aspire to be our route to importance and our route to the right to be heard. That is another trap. And it's no accident that it's taking place at the same time as the rise of identity politics, which also the lesson is that you have to have been oppressed or victimized in some way in order to even say anything and be part of the cultural conversation. And everyone else who hasn't been abused and oppressed, anyone who's privileged, has to shut the fuck up.
Yeah.
So women, I mean, I think one of the things that supercharged the Me Too movement was suddenly a lot of white women who'd also been told that they weren't oppressed enough and had to shut up, suddenly got to join the cult of victimhood and could finally get the kind of attention that they had been deprived of.
Right.
The Me Too movement is overwhelmingly white, and these are white women who get to make people feel sorry for them. Personally, I've never aspired to be felt sorry for. I mean, that's setting the bar rather low.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's so, yeah, as you say, I think we kind of live in this culture where oppression and marginalization and victimhood has been totally fetishized. So what that Aziz Ansari's story read as to, I think, most people, it was really quite unhelpful as far as the Me Too movement went because it made it look silly. But I think that read to most people, including, feminists, as somebody wanting to be victimized almost, which is not, I don't want that to be misconstrued as my saying that women want to be victimized, because of course nobody wants to be victimized, but to portray themselves as a victim. And like you say, I think that's really attached to having a voice. People want to be able to speak and tell their stories and be taken seriously, and it's difficult to do that in this culture unless you can attach your identity to some form of oppression and victimhood.
Yeah, and that's a larger problem in the Me Too movement. It is a problem with the whole identity politics movement.
Right.
And, as we've discussed, that has taken over mainstream culture. So everyone has a sob story. It's obviously there's a way in which there's a table turning, which is gratifying, but I don't think that it's in the interests of even genuinely oppressed groups to tell them that essentially their biggest friend is their oppression, that's their calling card.
Or to tell people that they have to attach themselves to their trauma or their victimization forever, to tell people that they aren't resilient and that they can't recover from bad situations or even traumatic situations. I worry about that a little bit.
Yeah, I do too.
Yeah. I mean, and so
we could stand to celebrate resilience a little more, which doesn't mean letting culprits off the hook.
No.
But, if someone does actually do something terrible to you, you let them win twice if not only do you have to go through this terrible thing, but then you allow them to ruin the rest of your life. That's a big mistake. Now, there are going to be some people who are sufficiently traumatized from something genuinely terrible happening to them, and they're not going to be able to recover, and that is a tragedy. That's not to be celebrated. That is a tragedy.
Mm-hmm. One of the things so I've been incredibly frustrated by the left these days. I see a lot of knee jerking, lazy thinking, groupthink. This thing where heretics are banished if they ask the wrong questions or don't take the right positions or associate with the wrong people. Sit next to the wrong people, talk to the wrong people. And I've started to question and push back this idea that there's like a clear divide even between left and right. I don't think that those labels are accurately applied to most people. And even often the people who are put in those categories of left and right, I think that it probably isn't a totally accurate descriptor. Nobody fits perfectly within those boxes. And I would sort of rather people just talk about their beliefs and talk about their politics rather than saying I'm left wing or I'm right wing. This is my tribe, and that's coming from I was always a really firm leftist most of my life, and then started to sort of see what was going on the left and didn't necessarily want to be associated with that anymore. So like you said, you're not particularly upset that all these people who don't like you or think you're the bad guy now or whatever, you're not particularly upset by that because maybe you don't have a ton of respect for those people. And I feel that way as well. The people who've rejected me on the left, I don't have any intellectual or political respect for. But I wonder if do you position yourself anywhere on the political spectrum, or do other people position you anywhere on the political spectrum? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think I get positioned on the political spectrum. I don't identify with either left or right, partly because I think those directional terms have corrupted, and they are borderline meaningless now. The left is now characterized by a kind of Stalinism and authoritarianism and an impulse to control and dominate. And that was, when I was growing up, that was a right-wing impulse, to impose a very strict morality on other people. That's the crap from conservatives in the United States in the 1950s, who told you what to think and what to wear and whether you could have sex and that you couldn't take drugs and, you had to go to church. You had to believe in the United States and wave a flag. Those were the conservatives. They were the Republicans. Now, it just so happens the left has a different list of things you can and cannot do, but the impulse to control is identical. Mm-hmm. In my youth, the left was trying to get people to do whatever they want. It was that whole let it all hang out sensibility. It was trying to get people to enjoy their lives and to reject these artificial strictures and to take drugs if they wanted to and have sex if they wanted to. And it's not as if there weren't some strong political opinions. A lot of, obviously all the Vietnam War protests, etc. But that stuff was not about controlling other people and what they were supposed to think and say. It had to do with something real. It had to do with a real military action that was stupid and wrong. So I just I can't identify with the left even as left. It's not left wing anymore. It's something else. Mm-hmm. And when we say right wing, all we mean is racist. It's lost any implication of you want a balanced budget, you want a small state, you know, there's no. I mean, it used to be associated with law and order, but now the left is very law and order in their own way, you know, with the enforcement of hate crime legislation, etc. I mean, it's almost flipped around, and lacking any other terminology, I have categorized myself as a libertarian, which I picture as something at perpendicular to the right-left axis. So, you know, the libertarian's creed pretty much reduces to you should be able to do whatever you want as long as you don't hurt anybody else. And I think that's the core principle of the U.S. Constitution. That's really what it boils down to. And I think it's a rational creed, and it has lots of wider applications. Libertarians have sometimes been accused of being against environmental regulations, and I think that's ridiculous because pollution hurts people. I mean, that's primitive. So of course one should be able to legislate against destroying the air and the other people breathe and the water that they drink. So I mean, I would go so far as to say that I think people should be able to hurt themselves as long as they're not hurting anyone else. I.e., I would decriminalize drugs. I'm not big on, legislation designed to make people little perfect automatons. I don't like fat taxes. I don't like, laws that are just trying to legislate virtue. So, that's as close as I can come to positioning myself. Otherwise, I feel kind of left out of the whole, because I don't identify with any position. At this point, I don't especially identify with any political party, and I don't think I'm alone. Another way of classifying myself is to say, in some ways, I'm a classical liberal, in the old sense of the word. And there's a whole group of classical liberals on the web and on YouTube who now seem, like mavericks. But actually, they're just defending some pretty old standard principles that used to be the province of the left. Most importantly, freedom of speech.
Mm-hmm. It's funny because I feel like the left is actually alienating people as opposed to getting people on board. And one of the ways that they're doing that is by labeling everyone who doesn't go along with what they want, right, or like alt-right. I don't even know what alt-right means because the way that it's used is so ridiculous.
Right? All of these terms get so overused and so over-applied. So that's what the word racist doesn't mean anything anymore, right? Everyone's a racist. We've just pointed that finger so many times that, the first time someone called me a racist, never to my face, of course, I was pretty appalled and angry. And now I don't have any reaction whatsoever because it's utterly meaningless. Mm-hmm. And white supremacist is now the same thing because that's just been a big switchover. Racist got flat. It wasn't extreme enough, and inconveniently it could also apply to people who weren't white. So white supremacist is more convenient, and it sounds more alarming. But it isn't even alarming anymore because everyone's a white supremacist. And that term used to mean something. It used to apply to a very particular group of people, and they were proud to be white supremacists. They would happily describe themselves as white supremacists, and in fact, that used to be the virtually the definition. So you didn't accuse someone of that. They wore the label proudly, and now it's just another word for I don't like you.
Well, I mean, I see myself called a white supremacist and like extreme right online pretty regularly, and I find it funny more than anything else because it's not attached to anything that I've ever done or said. It's just words that are attached to me because these people don't like me for whatever reason and want to try to bully other people into not listening to me or taking me seriously or reading my work or associating with me or whatever. So they're going to have to start coming up with more extreme words. But I mean, I also find it weird because, you would think that the left wants people on board and they're kind of doing the opposite, like pushing them away because they can't fit within this really, really tiny box, or because again they don't go along with all the go-to positions, or they ask the wrong questions, or they're in a photo with the wrong person or whatever.
Well, this is cult-like behavior.
Yeah.
And cults are by their nature exclusionary as well as inclusive of their own group. And typically they fall apart because inside the cult the members start going for each other, and you see that on the left now a lot.
Yeah. I noticed recently that a few years ago at least, maybe a little more than that, I used to write for and do some editing for this left-wing site in Canada. It's a pretty dinky site, like it's not a particularly relevant site, but I was there for, a few years and produced a lot of work for them. So I published a lot of writing there. I published a lot of podcasts there. I did editing for them. And I noticed recently that they had surreptitiously removed every single piece of work from my site. So they'd removed all of my writing, all of the podcasts. They'd practically scrubbed my name from the entire site. And it's not because because they disagreed with any of the work that I had produced there, any of the writing that I had published there. I mean, most of that writing and work, went along with leftist thinking. It was mostly about feminism. That was most of the work that I was doing. So some of it was maybe controversial for various reasons, but it's because I have become a problematic figure because of my critiques of gender identity ideology and trans activism and stuff. So they're sort of trying to disassociate themselves from me, not even from my work. And I find that weird. First of all, I find it weird that, I mean, this has not just happened to me. This has happened to lots of people where work is published and then unpublished because the social justice warriors, or whatever you want to call them, complain and bully the publication into taking it down. But it's this weird, attempt to erase people from the world and to erase people's ideas from the world. And I guess, I mean, has that ever happened to you?
Not yet, not that I know of. But yes, I'm the kind of person to whom that happens. I wonder whether there's something about the digital environment that makes people think in terms of disappearing. I mean, the delete key is so effortless.
Yeah.
People live so much online. You start thinking in these terms that you can get rid of a tweet. You can just make things disappear in the digital world, and maybe it just seems as if you could do that to people, and that certainly is what's happening, and it's creepy as hell. I've written about this at some length, but this whole business of punishing sinning artists by making their work go away gives me the heebie-jeebies, and I have objected to that habit, not just on account of artists who I did a piece for Harper's on this called Cruel and Unusual Punishment, because that is what I consider it to be. That it's bad enough that you ruin somebody's reputation and make it so they can't do any more work. But it seems unjust to punish what has often not been criminal behavior and nothing that has stood up in court with vanishing anything they have ever accomplished in their lives. I think that's an outrage. But I also think it's an outrage on behalf of the arts consumer, because we're easily in the universe where you might not be able to get any more Woody Allen movies, right? He's not been convicted of anything. But and I don't want to have that option taken away from me. The injustice would not just be to Woody Allen, but to all the people who want to watch his movies. Somehow the cultural gatekeepers from on high now feel that it is their right to remove tainted merchandise from the marketplace.
I guess so. I mean, as much as I try really hard to be as honest as I possibly can about, my beliefs, regardless of who it might piss off. And at the same, I'm not particularly fearful. I never have been particularly fearful in terms of my work. And I've always been controversial, but, of course I do have some fear around alienating allies or people who've supported me for a long time. And especially now because, like I said, I don't care about these people on the left who, don't want me. I don't want them either. But I've started to question some of the ideologies and beliefs and mantras that I've accepted and repeated for so long. So I get worried about what women in the feminist movement, if I'm going to anger them or disappoint them or whatever, partly because they're people that I really respect a lot and who have done incredibly important work that is incredibly valuable. So they're not people that I don't respect or don't care about. They're people that I do respect and I do care about a lot. But at the same time, I do have to be authentic and I do have to ask questions that I think are important questions. And I do want to maintain autonomy and I do want to make sure that I hang onto this ability to still say what I really think, even if it is going to piss off my tribe, as it were. I'm trying to sort of distance myself from that kind of tribalism because I don't think that it's healthy, but I'll use that word for these purposes. I wonder, do you ever worry about the repercussions of taking unpopular positions, or does it not bother you at all?
Well, I try to be aware of the environment in which I am speaking and writing. It would be ignorant of me not to know when I'm writing about a sensitive, controversial subject that can get me into trouble. So, when I write a column and it's on one of these tricky subjects, I don't set out to get myself into trouble. I'm not baiting people deliberately. As you do, I infer, I try to say what I think, what I really think, without, necessarily setting out to offend people. But, and one of the ways that I try to say what I think is to couch it in terms that are as humorous as possible. And interestingly, it's actually the humor that has sometimes got me into trouble, because there are certain subjects that this hard left contingent does not believe should be worthy of jokes. That you're just too serious. You can't make jokes about diversity. And of course, anything that you're not supposed to make jokes about is irresistible to me. So far I'm getting away with it. I actually think that most of the views that I put forward are pretty moderate. And I do often try to give voice to what I believe is what is really mainstream opinion, what most people think, but maybe is not exactly what you're supposed to say right now. So far, I haven't paid any kind of ultimate price. It's entirely possible that there are invitations that I have not received, to speak or to appear at a festival or to publish somewhere. But honestly, I have enough opportunities to speak, and there are too many people asking me to write things. And I go to too many festivals already, so maybe I've just done myself a favor.
Right. You might have been overwhelmed otherwise. I have one last question. It's gotten a bit dark over on your end. I'm not sure if you have any lights that you could turn on, but I mean, we can still hear you fine, and that's the most important thing. So, I mean, yeah, that's better.
The sun's going down.
Oh, there we go. Perfect. I wonder if you think, I mean, you said you're quite cynical, so maybe I know the answer, but maybe not. I wonder if you think that this era of, like, I'm trying to not use buzzwords myself, so I'm saying this era of political correctness, but I don't know, maybe you have a better way of describing it, this fad, where art is policed for diversity more than quality. You called it prissiness on Brendan O'Neill's podcast, which I liked. This like virtue signaling, virtue signaling is valued so much more than authenticity, which really bothers me partly just because I find it extremely boring, people pretending that they have perfect thoughts all the time. It's just not true. And I don't want to be around anybody who has perfect thoughts all the time. Anyway, that's interesting. But I wonder if you think it's turning around, like, are people getting sick of it or is it just getting worse? Where do you think this is going?
I don't know where this is going. Most people are sick of it, but they've been sick of it for quite some time now. And in terms of the hypersensitivity, especially anything to do with language, it's definitely getting worse. And there's definitely a feeling of the walls closing in terms of what we've been discussing, what you're allowed to say, what you have the standing to say. It takes less and less to become this huge, big deal offense. Like, yes, last night it was Joe Biden's reference to the word boy. Did you follow that? It was difficult to follow, but it occupied, an hour of CNN. And it's tedious. It's petty. It's, get a life stuff. And I don't know whether it needs to go even farther to just be overthrown, or maybe it's going to take something worse. I mean, it seems to me this is the kind of stupid infighting and picayune obsession with having your toes stepped on that's really characteristic of peacetime and prosperity. Like, you don't actually, the real problem is you don't have enough problems. Mm-hmm. And real problems. In fact, you've even forgotten what real problems are. And I have said this before, but I worry that what may finally bring some of this crap to an end real problems.
Hmm.
A war, a real war, not some stupid little thing off the other side of the planet where people we don't know idiotically join the army or getting killed, and it doesn't do anything to us. I mean, an actual war or a real catastrophe, a real a pandemic from nowhere, and suddenly millions or even billions of people are dropping like flies. I'm just speculating in my fiction writer a little way, but these things do happen. And yeah, then I think that we'd stop worrying about, who's a white supremacist and, who used the wrong pronoun. I think that would just go straight out the window.
Yeah, that's occurred to me also, that it sort of seems like we've got it a bit too good, and so we've decided to start inventing problems where there aren't really any, because we have too much stuff. We have access to everything that we need. I'm saying we, I mean not everyone in the world. I'm talking about, us in the West, in North America, people who are not living in poverty, people who are, basically the people who occupy the left, who are like, as much as you and I might dislike that word privilege because it's thrown around too much, most of the people who are occupying the left and who are dictating who can say what, they're not people who are oppressed at all. They're people who are educated, they've been to university, most of them are middle or upper class.
Most of them are white.
Most of them are white. Like,
ironically, this whole identity politics thing is mostly white.
Yeah.
They get poster boys and girls from different races and drag them on and use them, but it's really it's all about power. It's all about grabbing power. And these are people who are often very well connected and, as you said, well educated. These are not the people who are driving this movement are quite comfortable.
Yeah. And so they're inventing trauma. They're inventing victimhood, and they're claiming to be traumatized by people's words. So they're talking about, disagreeable opinions as hate speech or violence. And, to me, it can only be that these people don't know what real oppression is like, that they don't know what real violence is like, that they don't know what real trauma is like, because otherwise you wouldn't turn trauma and violence and oppression into such ridiculousness, into such a joke.
And if we're going to be a little more generous,
okay.
Look, none of us live by bread alone. We all need a sense of purpose, a sense of calling, a sense of usefulness, a sense of direction. And most of the people we're talking about do not adhere to mainstream religion. They need a sense of moral structure and community that this movement gives them. And so the impulse, I mean, I don't like joining, the impulse to join, but that's just me. I can see that for an awful lot of people, they need to feel a part of something larger than themselves. That's actually healthy. I have big problems with the culture of identity politics, but I can see that it is answering a kind of thirst, especially in younger people, for meaning and direction in their lives. I wish it were taking a more benevolent form. I don't mind the idea of being sensitive to the rights of others. There's nothing wrong with that. But I don't like the predatory nature of the movement. And the way in which it's also very competitive. So they compete with each other to see who can be more righteous. And that ends up being a race to the bottom, not to the top. But I do think it is worth, breaking the hostility and appreciating that everything that motivates these people is not bad. And I am also motivated by many of the same forces. So when I discuss these things, I am also trying to make myself useful. I am responding to a sense of calling, if you will. I think it's really important at this time that people in the arts like me, and also people who have traditionally been from the left, the old left, speak out for liberty and for not just diversity of race and gender, but diversity of opinion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, me too. That's all from me. I really enjoyed talking with you today, and I really appreciate you making time for the conversation, and I really appreciate your willingness to perhaps be unpopular in a time when we're all supposed to be trying to be liked above all else.
Well, I could say the same to you. You've nosed about the web a little, and you've faced some headwinds of your own with good cheer, I might add. So keep up the good fight.
Yeah, well, I can't seem to help myself, so.
The only way that we preserve the right to say things is to say them.
Totally. Okay, well, have a really great night. Thanks again.
Yeah, you too.
Okay, take care. Bye.